And please join me welcoming Mike Prentice.
Great. Thank you all for having me. I just wanted to, before I begin my talk, I just wanted to say a special thanks to Professor Kwok for the kind words today, but also the support that he and the NOM Center have given me over the last year, and even actually before I came to Michigan. When I first applied here, I had written that I would do my research, or proposed to do my research in Italy or Korea, and right as about the time I was deciding, I had learned that I received the Korea Foundation grant, and that made a big difference in deciding to come to Michigan, and is also deciding to go to study Korea and not Italy for the time being. And I have to say that my fate was somewhat sealed, but I haven't regretted it for a minute. I'd also just like to thank Ji-Young Lee, Do-hee Morsman, and Professors Chung and Ryu for their support and welcoming me into the Michigan Korean community. So as Professor Kwok mentioned, I'm a second-year student studying anthropology, and I'm specifically studying linguistic anthropology. And last year I was a Korea Foundation Fellow, and this summer with an additional grant from the NOM Center, I spent about 3 months in Seoul doing the language course, as well as spending 1 month full-time at the company I'll be talking about today. But I also was able to hang around and work for a couple or 2 more months while I was doing the language course. So this was part of my preliminary ethnographic research, and for my larger dissertation research, I plan on studying corporate language policies, documents, and how they're related to constructing corporate identity inside and across chaebol companies. So I'll be sharing some of the insights I gathered today about English in the workplace, digital documents, and corporate voice. I originally shared this at a conference in Korea at Chunbuk University for an East Asian Anthropology Conference. And I'm really humbled to be sharing these preliminary results and or findings, and look forward to any constructive criticism or comments that you might have. So I just want to begin by just painting a small picture about the company I was working at over the summer. They were located in the Nonhyun area of Seoul, which is home to the famous Kagukori, the furniture street, as well as that also happens to be the area where the largest advertising agencies in Korea are located. While I was at this company, there were about 5 employees there, and they officially described themselves as a, quote, brand consultancy, or in Korean, branding wesa. And as a brand consulting company, their products consisted of essentially analyses, strategies, creative ideas about marketing and branding for their clients who were typically multinational Korean firms. So the employees at the company spent the majority of their time producing knowledge about branding through digital documents, primarily on Microsoft Word and PowerPoint. And if they weren't at a meeting or at lunch, you could usually find any of the employees working on a document on their laptop or working on it together. So as I observe these documents circulate throughout the company from hand to hand, and from one computer to the next, I began to notice that some documents were entirely in Korean, some were mixed Korean and English together, and some were composed entirely in English. So to my surprise, the documents that employees spent the majority of their time working on were those that were entirely in English, despite the fact that none of the employees had a native mastery of English, though all could communicate verbally in English very well. And I talked to them mostly in English while I was there. Sorry, Song-sang-nim. What was more, these documents usually represented the most important type of document for the company. So the documents in English were typically the documents that the company sent out to their clients that contained sort of, key product or key project, final recommendations, strategies, and analyses. So I started to ask myself questions about why, it seemed very peculiar to me at first, why were the most important documents in a language that none of the individual employees were native speakers of? And who decided which documents would be in English and others in Korean? And did employees complete these documents alone or together in groups? And was there something being said about the use of English beyond just the meaning of the words on the screen? So on the surface, the choice of English might be explained by the fact that it was just the language of international clients, and so the company really had no choice in the matter. So, many of the discursive events that went into making the documents, as well as its afterlife, were entirely in Korean, though. So, even if thus the document was in English, a lot of the other practices to make that document would be in Korean. So, if employee was presenting this document at a meeting, he or she would usually speak it over in Korean. Emails too that contain the documents, saying, here is the final document for our creative brief, for example. These would be written in Korean as well. Likewise, if one employee edited the document for the other, those would be in Korean. So I started to see that English was, the use of English was focalizing in and around the language inscribed in the digital documents, even though the language around it was still in Korean. So I started to think about over the summer, what was it about these documents, and specifically their digital format, that made English seem like the natural and logical choice. So I want to talk about two main areas of what I investigated further. One looks at exactly whose voice is being created through the construction of these documents in English. And the other area that I wanted to investigate was how the actual properties of digital documents allow, as well as constrain, a voice to be created. So there are three properties identified that connect these two aims together. They're called heteroglossic invisibility, semantic transparency, and digital leftovers. And I'll talk about those a little bit later. But I just wanted to start talking about the first rabbit hole that I went down. So one of the fascinating things about the employee's production of digital documents is that for all the labor time invested in constructing these documents, it sometimes could take multiple weeks just on one single PowerPoint. Most of the digital documents never even listed the names of the employees anywhere on any page or slide. So a future reader, a client who received this PowerPoint presentation, for example, would only see the company's name that was written in English displayed in a really big font on the title slide and then on each subsequent slide after that. We read about corporations all the time, and we often take for granted that that they can do or say or write or report things, and without often thinking about who created such documents or where they even came from. And here's just kind of a random sampling of press releases in English just got yesterday. So if anyone wonders when the new Galaxy Nexus is coming out, it's soon. So the question for my project became focalized around how can we take seriously the processes that create a company as a type of agent that is disembodied from any human speaker but mediated through words written or typed. There's a professor here named Matthew Hull, who's an anthropology professor here at Michigan, who's written a lot about the role of documents inside bureaucracies in Pakistan. He's argued that one of the central tasks of bureaucracy is to construct precisely a corporate agent out of the collective work of individuals. And he elaborates that corporate agency, and here I'll use his definition, is action that is not dissolvable into the agency of distinct individuals. The objective should describe how and why in bureaucratic processes corporate agency is realized in any sense in which we can talk about collective action being real. So the challenge is to understand collectivization and individualization as simultaneous functions of the same bureaucratic processes, taking neither the agency of the individual nor the organization as given. So I like this quote because it shows that part of the work that employees do is the construction of the companies themselves as agents in the world. So employees engage in work in which they represent and speak for themselves as well as the company. So we should heed both processes, employee making and corporation making, as mutually constituting each other, rather than trying to uncover, the employee or the individual agency lying beneath, a big bad corporation. So now, company is constructed not just through PowerPoint documents, of course. There are many different types of text that can make up a company. Certainly one is through legal papers of incorporation. And at the company I worked at, they had a website, business cards, certainly all the logos that were all over the wall. But I think there's a difference between certain types of static or fixed text and the everyday practice of creating, editing, reviewing PowerPoint and Word and other types of presentations that were really living documents. And like I mentioned, employees spent almost all of their time working on these documents. And I would argue here that it's the linguistic performance, specifically of English, in these documents that becomes the way for the company to demonstrate its presumed competence in English. So to give a quick historical example, I wanted to point to the only English language ethnography of a chaebol written in Korea by an anthropologist named Roger Janelli. He wrote a book called Making Capitalism in 1993, which addressed issues of resistance and opposition between upper and lower levels of management inside one chaebol. So in that monograph, Janelli gives a brief description of of a corporate brochure inside the company that outlined the philosophy of harmony. And what I found interesting about this little description of the production of the brochure was that it was written in both Korean and English and then distributed around the company without any author attributed to it. So this kind of underlines the importance of how employees at a company are able to construct the company as not just a disembodied agent, but one that can actually have its own philosophy and then do so in two languages. The example, I think, shows how corporate voices are crafted through text, and then these take on a specific material form, like the brochure in Janelli's example. But in thinking about the performance here in the case where I was working, I think it's important to understand who exactly the company is talking to and who might be, listening or judging to their performance. So I just want to give a little bit more background on the company where I worked. So established about 2 years ago, the company was created as a joint venture between two independent brand consulting companies, one in Europe and one in the United States, both of which had long connections to clients in Korea, but didn't have any Korean personnel or office space in Seoul. So with a projected growth in Korean business, the founding objectives of the company aimed to provide a local Korean presence to interface directly with Korean clients, to help develop new business projects, and to collaborate with the other workers in Europe and the United States. But the key value or edge that the company felt that it possessed stemmed from this ability to transition seamlessly between the worlds of Korea and the West. On one level, this was a type of non-stop work cycle where clients might expect that somewhere in the world someone was always working on their project. And having seen the clock strike midnight on many nights, I can attest this was not too far from the truth. Often we would literally work from, you work all day, finish maybe editing a document at 9 p.m. at night, which is about 10 a.m. New York time, send the document to New York. They would work on it all day, and then the process would continue. But at another level, I think this sort of transitioning between Korea and the U.S. and Europe meant also a linguistic or communicative ability to, transition between Korean and English and the respective norms of communication among Korean and European and American styles of business contact. So in this manner, the company's value was predicated on the ability to demonstrate this sort of bilingual competence as a natural characteristic of itself. So I want to talk about how can they do this, but why, but also thinking about why is bilingualism seen as a trait of being global. There's a linguistic anthropologist named Joseph Park who's written a number of articles on the role of English in South Korea. He's got a very interesting book about ideologies of English in South Korea. And he writes that in Korea, and here I'm quoting him, competence in English is interpreted as a sign of a globally oriented person, or gukjain, whose cosmopolitan outlook befits the global vision of a world-class corporation, an ideal employee who performs freely and competently in the transnational space of global business. It's important, I think, to remember that this bilingual competence is not just about knowing two different codes, but really, being able to translate one word for another, but rather through exhibiting the characteristics of one who has traveled the world and can operate in these two different spaces successfully. So in the space of a small office in Yeonhyangdong, which was right above a Burger King, the use of English was really a passport to places farther away and something that the company could market to its clients in Korea. I want to mention one distinction, though. Park here is talking about the individual person who strives to befit the international reputation of a global corporation. But I think in the case of the company I'm talking about, the relationship is actually reversed. It's the company itself, in trying to naturalize its competence in both Korean and English, is trying to present itself as a Gukchain or a bilingual person who has naturalized skills in both languages. I think this is significant because, as I mentioned before, none of the employees actually had full native competence in English and were very conscious of making errors when having to write in English. And as I'll talk about it in a little bit, digital documents are vital to being able to perform this presumed competency. So, as any good ethnographer or anthropologist should admit, I also played a role in this company. I wasn't just hanging out and taking notes all day, especially given that I was the only native English speaker and someone who had worked in marketing in the U.S. I should also admit that my Korean level skills at the time weren't only at an intermediate level, so I almost always spoke English with the other employees, though I'm sure they also liked speaking English with me more than I like speaking English with them, or more than I like speaking Korean with them, sorry. So my task in the office, while they were sort of loosely defined before I went, often focused around English language activities like talking to Korean clients in English, just going to meetings, drafting documents in English, talking sort of interpreting with employees in the U.S. and Europe, and then providing knowledge about U.S. consumer markets and brands and it was interesting. A lot of projects they worked on were about U.S. consumers, but many of the employees had never been to the U.S. and so I would say these are like magazines that this type of consumer reads or that kind of knowledge that they didn't have on hand. So there's one other reason I think it's interesting to think about the company as trying to position itself as a Gukchain. And as I mentioned, they only had about 5 employees when I was working there, and they were in this area, Nonhyungdong, where you can literally see the big ad agency signs on the buildings. And these ad agencies are very large, well-funded, and the company I was working at didn't really have the financial resources to offload translation work to third parties or even hire employees who had studied all over the world. And also its clients, to think about it, these clients at Chaebol and the international marketing departments were often very proficient at English. So they were constantly gauging their own performance in English in relation to the perception of its clients, as well as to its Western affiliates who did not employ any Korean speakers and depended on the company I was at to relay messages from English to Korean or Korean to English very clearly. So I just wanted to recap a little bit what I was saying about the construction of corporate agency through English. So while the English might have been determined by the fact that corporate policy demanded it or that its Western affiliate companies didn't even speak Korean, the performance of English, in a way, became a way for the company to demonstrate its own bilingual competence among clients, but tied up in this was a risk that if the company did not perform very well, they might ruin that edge that they sought to exhibit. So I want to now shift to talking about, check my time, the documents themselves, and how the properties of documents allow for this voice to be produced, but also in maybe ways that it constrains it in new ways as well. So digital documents open up a space for new possibilities that are not afforded by oral or even handwritten communication. So I just want to point out a couple basic differences, then I'll explain these clunky terms. So take, for example, when presenting a PowerPoint, an employee might, typically the boss, would present a voiceover in Korean to the contents of a document. Just as if I were presenting this document in English, I would be sort of loosely translating it into Korean as part of the presentation to the other Korean clients. But what's interesting is that the words that he speaks are not actually recorded in any sense. They didn't put a recorder, people took infrequent notes, but the words on paper or the words on the screen were the ones that continued to circulate or were referred back to. So if anyone said, "What did this company say?" they would look to the document which spoke in English or which was written in English. Similarly, even thinking about emails that constantly go back and forth between the clients and the company in Korean, while also digitized, these only had a very small circulation between whoever was on the email list. But it was commonly believed that once a document was produced and sent to a client, that it could go anywhere in the company and that anyone might see it. And actually, this was and maybe it's true, is that this is a way for the company to get new business, right? So if everyone in, ABC company sees our document and sees how good we are at English, and sees the good work we do, then that will be a new way for us to get new business. Another interesting thing, thinking about just digital documents versus maybe something handwritten, is that when you type on a digital document, it doesn't leave sort of a biological or a biomechanical trace of the individual, just like when speaking versus writing something. When you speak, it naturally leaves a trace of your own voice. It is imbued kind of with your own personality. But when you start writing on a screen, there is nothing inherent about the words on the screen that leaves a trace about your own self. And someone pointed out to me that Microsoft PowerPoint has this sort of metadata that it can track, who and who wrote what word. But no one ever quite knew of that fact. So in some ways, thinking about a Korean employee who has to present and might have an accent and is highly conscious of that accent, writing or typing in this case is in some ways a way to hide their accent. So with some of the basic distinctions between digital documents, I want to turn to these three properties that I've picked out here and talk about what role they play in constructing or enabling and also constraining the construction of corporate voice. So the first one is this term, and I made all these up, and I'm still working with them as kind of things to think with. The first one is heteroglossic invisibility. So the heteroglossia is a term that was coined by the literary scholar Bakhtin, and it describes kind of the state of multiple voices or multiple vernaculars present in any society, full of different accents, different words, different types of people that are associated with them. And invisibility essentially means making these multiple voices hidden behind the curtain or subsuming them to a dominant voice. And because when you start writing on a document digitally, it doesn't leave a trace of the individual author. So if you have your own voice, your own accent, when you start writing, all employees to some degree are restrained or constricted in the type of voice that is left on screen. So invisibility in this sense almost comes by default when anyone starts typing up a document. And more importantly, I think all the labor, editing, versioning, all of that work that goes into a document made over 2 weeks or sometimes 1 month, that gets sort of erased or contracted when the document is finalized, opposed to think about when someone edits something by hand, that you can't erase that smudge mark as much as you want. So I think I would argue that this creates that sort of possibility for the company to present a document as authored by the company itself, and furthermore for any employee to do this. It doesn't require the boss to authorize, to write as part of the voice of the company. Any employee, high or low, could presumably just write, our company says this. So I would argue that this easily creates the possibility for the company to present any document as authored by the company. And for example, when I would make minor changes to a document, no one would ever write, Mike edited this document or Mike contributed to this document. Or even, I think more interestingly, if the boss was asked to do something and he had no time or did not want to do it, he would pass it to a junior employee who could then write, what was needed and then, author it as from the company. And the client would have, in some sense, no idea whether, who was the true author or whose voices were actually represented on paper. It would just appear that the only author of the document was the company itself. So rather than thinking about this as sort of a dominant corporate voice obscuring other voices, I think actually this had a lot of advantages for the company. So by erasing the multiple voices behind a document, the company could effectively hide its small size, right? They only had 5 people, and they were surrounded by these agencies that had 500 people. When you write a digital document, you effectively conceal whether it has 5 or 50. You can't quite tell how many people actually worked on this document. It can also hide the fact that its labor force might change from year to year. So, the company, I had heard that, they had sort of the 5 people that were there when I was there, half of them hadn't been there the year before. So while employees may come and go, the corporate voice can sort of stay the same, and to outsiders, it seems like nothing has really changed. And I think there actually might be some advantages if you're from thinking about this from the point of a lower level employee. Because their names weren't attributed to any document, while their efforts were made invisible, it also meant that no one could easily be blamed for any mistake or mistranslation once a document was finalized and sent off into cyberspace. So I want to talk about the next term here, which is semantic transparency. So often the company was asked to translate one document from Korean to English for the sake of their non-Korean speaking affiliates. So if a person in New York or Europe had to, create a logo and they needed background information that the Korean company had supplied, but that was only in Korean, the company I was at would be asked to translate it. But I should say that this was the least favorite task that they had, and it was often, sent right to the bottom of the hierarchy of employees. So when this occurred, though, they would still have to go to a great amount of effort to obtain an accurate translation of the text while simultaneously stressing to preserve the original features of the document, such as the layout, font choice, colors, etc., so that the original and the translated version appeared as literally identical copies of each other except for the language choice. What I think the effect of this does is this creates an iconic link between the two languages as basically communicative media that can be substitutable for each other. So what it does is it shows that the company can move from one language to the other with relative ease. It's saying, oh, we can go from Korean to English, and you really see no residual effects, because I think in part that's done through having the documents look almost identical except for language. But despite the fact that this created the effect, but the fact that it also took up a lot of time, and employees really did not like doing this precisely because it took a lot of time. As it was preserved in its final form, though, all the hours spent translating, adjusting, and proofreading were also obscured in this type of temporal contraction, as the digital, format hid the labor time, involved in the creation. So oftentimes, however, this process did not go as seamlessly as anyone hoped. Leaving aside for the fact that words are the inherent intranslatability of any terms, from a document point of view, creating an exact replica was actually very difficult, because in some cases you would have a document that was actually locked, meaning you couldn't go around and play with all the words. And in that case, I saw in a couple cases where the employees would literally redraw everything on PowerPoint by hand to literally make it so it seemed exactly like the original, and go to quite a lot of effort to do this. But it's worth noting, right, that I never saw a document translated from English to Korean and only from English. Sorry, there was never a document translated from English into Korean and only went from Korean to English. Perhaps a reflection of the fact that all Korean employees were expected just to know English and be competent in reading it, but no English employees were ever expected to know Korean. So I want to turn to the last one here, which slightly more playful term, digital leftovers. Many of the documents that the company produced, right, were in PowerPoint and Word. So these were the generally preferred programs for clients in Korea and also their Western partners, and generally provided a smoother way to collaborate across borders. You didn't have to worry about, using whatever the Hancom viewer, the Korean word processing. So they got used to using these Microsoft Word and PowerPoint. So since the company used these programs, one benefit of the common format was it allowed the company to they could draw upon previously produced documents and presentations prepared both by them and other affiliates for use on new projects. So, for example, if it required writing a creative brief for a new logo design, the company employees could look at what an old creative brief looked like and literally copy many of the properties or even the overall sort of layout of that document. So, in a sort of like making a template. And the fact that these were in English was also really helpful. So they provided employees with a sort of a faster way to develop English language-based documents that were already pre-approved as naturalized, rather than having to create English documents from scratch. So the use of such documents was also allowed the company to establish English as literally a material backdrop to many of its processes and projects, thereby making it seem as if the company was intimate with working entirely in English, even if that creative brief, for example, might have come from a New York or Europe office. So in the first two examples, I pointed out how the process of editing can obscure the multiple authors and labor time involved in the production of a document and more easily enable the authorship of the corporation to come out. With the templates, however, they often included fields that had been created from another project. I mean, literally sometimes you'd see, oh, this slide was a really great slide from that other project. Let's just copy it and put it into this new one. So embedded precisely into the fact that the documents made English more readily available was also the potential risk of being exposed as copying information from a previous project to the current one. Advertising agencies are probably guilty of this a lot, and when I used to work in marketing, I have to say that many times you do use not just templates but also creative ideas or strategies that are slightly modified, but sometimes not, in use with new projects. But I think the risk in this case with the Korean company is that not just being seen as a copier, but rather seen as someone whose English competency isn't even authentic at all. So I want to just start wrapping up here by saying that, first of all, much more could be said about the role of English in the workplace, especially in regards to complex code mixing between English and Korean, which I hope to explore more when I'm more competent in Korean. I mean, there were really interesting slides that would just have English and Korean almost seeming to alternate every other word. And hopefully for my dissertation research, I'll be able to analyze that. But also, even thinking outside the documents, just being able to trace or follow the trajectory or the social lives of these documents as they move across companies, and if lucky, maybe across borders. Though I'm discovering that it's much easier to send a document around the world than an anthropologist. So for the Summers project, I wanted to follow closely to the material, properties through which, in the material properties and objects through which the company was able to construct not just a corporate agent, but a specific type of corporate subjectivity, that being the ideal globalized Korean speaker of English. And for the company I worked at, the need to demonstrate this competency put enormous pressure to reproduce itself linguistically through documents, just as the need to present itself globally implied having conference calls at all hours of the day or night. These issues were definitely compounded as the company only had a small workforce that had constantly to attend to such demands. I want to end just with a small anecdote that happened one day in the summer. Since this company only had about 5 people, while I was there, and besides for one conference room, everything that happened in the office was fairly visible to everyone else. And I was working on something at my desk when 2 employees emerged from about an hour-long conference call, and they were very frustrated. And one began to complain very rapidly in Korean about the meeting, but I couldn't understand what exactly they were talking about. So rather than intrude and say, what happened and have my notepad out, I decided to later ask when things had calmed down what the issue had been about. And one employee told me that in the call that they had with the client had decided, rather than give them a very exciting project or exciting tasks, in studying consumer behavior or coming up with new recommendations about branding and marketing, that they had just been given a lot of mundane tasks, not, that the employees were just not excited about, and they didn't even think that this is the type of work that the company should be doing. So when I asked the other employee, what did they say, or what did she say about that, and she said, in reporting this, she said, what do they think we are, just a translation company? So, during the summer I had been looking at how the performance of English reflected back onto the competency of the company as a as a way to create itself as a viable global business partner for both Korean and Western affiliates alike. So it took me a while to understand the connection between proving competence in English and being considered just a translation company. I think, with this little anecdote, you can see how embedded in the ability to show its skills as a bilingual company it carries it with the risk of being considered just a translation company for whom language is merely a code or just a go-between and not the production of living, breathing people. And there I'll stop. So thank you very much. I look forward to your comments and questions.
Hi all. It's my great pleasure and honor to be presenting in front of all of you. My presentation today is entitled Media Diversity Evaluation, a Comparative Study of the US and South Korea. So today I'm going to be presenting in this order. First, I'm going to provide some background information from the real world and academic world, focusing on why media diversity matters. And then I'm going to provide results from 3 studies, each of which focuses on media minority ownership and diversity, media diversity measures, and audience and their politically diverse viewing. And then I'll wrap up with end remarks. So in Korea, in less than a month, the general service channels will be launched. The general service channels are similar to the concept of terrestrial TV channels in Korea, which is such as KBS, MBC, and SBS, in that they can schedule all genres of programming, such as sports, news, drama, entertainment, and all. However, they are aired only via cable TV and satellite TV, which allows them to broadcast 24/7 and to have commercial breaks. Interestingly, the 4 general service channels are affiliated with Joseon Daily, Jungang Daily, Donghwa Daily, and Mail business newspapers. The Joseon, Jungang, and Donghwa is the so-called big three conservative media newspapers in Korea, and Mail business newspaper is also another big business newspaper in Korea. So since 2009, there have been heated debates around the media law, whether we should permit the cross-ownership of TV and newspaper by launching these general service channels. And the biggest arguments against this launch revolves around media diversity, that if these big conservative newspaper players come into the TV broadcasting industry, it will result in less diversity of public opinion. So media diversity is definitely one of the core concepts which make media industries distinct from other industries. So via media, information, ideas, and cultures are delivered, while in most other industries, the products of other industries are goods. Since an open marketplace of ideas, meaning that a media environment with diverse viewpoints and information available is ideal for a healthy democracy. The media diversity has been treated as one of the core purposes of communications policy, in addition to economic efficiency. So today, technological convergence blurs the boundaries between media. For example, we can watch a news show or an entertainment show using cable TV, the internet, or our smartphone. Also, large media consolidations take place. In the US, recently, a merger between Comcast and NBC became a big issue. And also in Korea, these cross-ownership of TV and newspaper through the general service channels is a big issue. So there are concerns about how to protect media diversity while invigorating media industries, both in the US and South Korea. So delving a little bit into the historic legal foundations of media diversity, in the United States, it is based on the First Amendment. It has long been a right of the public to receive a diversity of views and information over the airwaves. It's clearly shown in Justice Black's quotation back in 1945. And in South Korea, media diversity is a recent issue. According to the broadcasting law, media diversity, or more specifically diversity of public opinion, has been treated as one of the scheduling criteria for broadcasters. And also, in order to guarantee broadcasters' diversity of public opinions, the diversity committee has been created. There's one famous quotation by Peter Drucker. The quote is, "If you cannot measure it, you cannot manage it." So for the people who are for the promotion of media diversity, the question remains is, how can we define and measure diversity of viewpoints? It's difficult. However, let's say if we can, then another issue that arises is that there is this anti-censorship constraint of the First Amendment, which doesn't allow policymakers to directly regulate content to control for diversity of viewpoints. So the policy institution, both in South Korea and the US, the Korea Communications Commission and the Federal Communications Commission, they have long been adopted structural regulation governing broadcast ownership. So this rests on the assumption that the diversity of ownership will result in the diversity of viewpoints. Let me explain this in the U.S. context. As we all know, the U.S. is a racially diverse country. So there have been debates around diversity and ownership policies, especially involving minority ownership, employment, and content. Back in the 1970s, media preference policies, essentially it is to promote minority ownership in broadcasting industries and to promote minority employment in those stations in order to promote a diversity of viewpoints. It was due to the FCC's realization of the serious underrepresentations of minorities in broadcasting ownership. But in the 1980s, the minority preference policies have been challenged. And even in 2011, while I was working in the FCC, there was a new case coming up. And the current FCC's diversity policy, the diversity order, is still being challenged. So the reason behind why these minority preference policies are being challenged is the doubts concerning the assumed relations between minority ownership, employment, and content. What the FCC's Chief Diversity Officer, Mark Lloyd, and I call the triangle. So over the summer in the FCC, I reviewed studies that were either funded by the FCC or recognized by the court that examined the nexuses between minority ownership, employment, and content. So there were more than 100 studies, and I individually reviewed around 40 to 50 studies. So before looking at each nexus, it may be helpful to have a sense of how each of the concepts were defined and measured. So regarding minority ownership, the racial identities of media outlet owners were identified using broadcast industry data. And the racial identity of employees were also identified in a similar fashion. There were more flexibilities in defining minority content, depending on what data were used. For example, if broadcast industry data were used, minority contents were defined as programming formats for minority audiences. When survey data or interview data were used, minority content were operationalized as owners' intention to tailor content to their communities. And then there were some other measures for minority content if researchers use content analysis of news. So regarding the first nexus between ownership, minority ownership, and employment. So it's a complicated table, but you can just look at the red letters on the left. So it seems that from 1980s to 2000, it seems that the prevalence of minority owners has been related to the employment of a more diverse group. And regarding the nexus between minority employment and minority content, there seems to be an association too between the minority employment and minority content. But the third nexus regarding minority ownership and content, the evidence wasn't very conclusive. Some researchers found a nexus while the others didn't when they operationalized minority contents as news and public affairs minutes. So basically they were looking at whether there were more news aired in minority-owned stations, which is questionable. But when the content is measured by using content tailored toward the minority communities, almost all studies found the nexus. But depending on what data each researcher used, contents for minority communities were measured slightly different. For example, if broadcast industry data were used, minority content were measured as certain programming formats for minority, for example, Spanish language, Black, SAS, and urban programming. And when survey and interviews of owners and managers were used, minority content were measured as owners' intention to promote content tailored toward their minority communities. And lastly, some researchers did content analysis, and they checked whether more minority appearance in news happened and more issues, more racially significant issues were covered in news content. So in minority-owned stations, these minority appearance in news and racially significant issues appeared. So wrapping up, there seems to be at least some support for the assumed nexuses between minority ownership, employment, and content, the triangle, and thus for some support for the FCC minority preference policies. However, there are definitely limitations of existing studies in that most of the studies use the broadcasting industry data, which doesn't allow researchers to do the longitudinal data analysis to clarify on causal directions between minority ownership, employment, and content. So to build upon the existing studies and further enlighten the FCC's diversity policies, I think it would be important to give efforts to clarify on why there are certain associations between these components. And also, among policymakers as well as scholars, there needs to be more discussion regarding how to define and measure minority content. For example, some studies looked at just news and public affair minutes as opposed to content tailored toward minority communities. If we believe that by promoting minority ownership, we would like to see more of the content tailored toward minority communities, we should do more research on this. However, we have to remember that the aim of promoting minority ownerships and devising these policies on ownership is to promote the diversity of viewpoints, which cannot be directly measured. So I guess more discussion among scholars and policymakers needs to be directed here. And also, these studies mostly considered just one or two services. So given the multimedia environment, it important to include more new medias into studies. So crossing the Pacific Ocean and coming back to the issue of media diversity in South Korea, the KCC, Korea Communications Commission policies are also interested in and focused on governing broadcast ownership. They aim to promote globally competitive Korean media, for example, by allowing TV and newspaper cross-ownership, while guaranteeing a certain level of diversity of public opinion. So in order to achieve this, they launched the Media Diversity Committee recently. And the head of the Media Diversity Committee was my professor in first year back in Korea University. The Media Diversity Committee put various efforts, such as holding a meeting with industry representatives, public hearings, and panel discussions. They announced the guidelines to calculate broadcasters' share of audiences, the KCC-BSA, in October 2010. And more recently, in July, the results for 2010 KCC-BSA made available. And they're planning to announce Media Influence Index, KCC-MII, which will cover more than just newspaper and TV. So this is going to be announced in 1 year or so. So the KCC-BSA aimed to provide an empirical basis for newspaper and TV cross-ownership regulation while also guaranteeing diversity of public opinion. For example, if a certain newspaper owner attempts to cross on a TV station, the KCC will calculate the BSA of the newspaper owner, and if it's more than 30%, they are going to inhibit the attempt. So study 2 looks at the 4 steps of KCC-BSA calculation. And I'm interested in comparing these to the FCC Diversity Index, which was devised in 2003, but was discarded. There are similarities and differences in those 2 measures that are worth discussing to further enlighten policymaking in both countries, especially regarding the design of the KCC-MII, which is going to happen soon. So before going into each step, I'd like to clarify that media includes TV, newspaper, and stuff like that. And outlets, for example, outlets of newspaper include Chosun Daily and Wall Street Journal. And outlets for TV includes KBS and ABC. So the first step involves choosing media. The KCC included newspaper and TV, including terrestrial, cable, and satellite TV, because their criterion in choosing the media was whether they outlets provide content on a real-time basis, whereas FCC-DI is more similar to the KCC-MII that's going to be announced, because they included TV, newspaper, radio, and the internet. All of them, but interestingly, cable and satellite TV were excluded because due to their national basis. So an important point to consider in further devising MII would be how to incorporate the internet and the smartphones. Well, because people nowadays access news, public affairs information via these new media. And the second step involves assigning weights to media. The KCC devised media exchange rate, which is essentially the ratio of newspapers' influence in forming public opinions to that of TV. And this was assessed to be 0.49. So the newspaper's influence in forming public opinions is about half of TV. And 0.49 was assessed based on two considerations. First, audience-wise, whether audiences used newspaper or TV to obtain public affairs information, and if they did, how much they use, and how the level of dependency of individual audiences for this individual media in obtaining public affairs information were considered. And market-wise, the ratio of advertising revenue of newspaper to that of TV based on industry data were accessed. The FCC diversity index also accessed media weights, but it was widely criticized because they relied on one survey questionnaire that asked whether individual audience used certain media to access news and public affairs information or not. So I think KCC-BSA did a pretty good job in assigning weights to media, but there may be a problem of multicollinearity because they consider too many components. And also, it's a good attempt to include advertising revenue as a criterion, but thinking about in KCC-MII, we may need to include the internet and smartphones in the index. It's interesting to see that the total industry advertising revenue is the biggest for terrestrial TV, followed by newspaper and online. However, in terms of the number one player within each media industry, the neighbor, the gateway for online services, has the largest advertising revenue, even when compared to MBC or Chosun Daily, the traditionally big players. So, and the third step involves assigning shares to outlets. And the KCC devised ratings based on, so for TV, ratings are accessed based on a survey of audience, and newspaper ratings are accessed by first getting the subscription rates based on readership data available industry-wise, and then these rates are multiplied by media exchange rate, which was accessed to 0.949, so that the ratings of newspaper can be compatible to TV ratings. However, the FCC Diversity Index chose a simple step. They put an emphasis on the number of available outlets, so they basically gave equal shares to all outlets within a medium. Thinking about future, the KCC-MII may need to think how to incorporate webs and apps in these indexes. And lastly, the fourth step is calculation and diagnosis. Finally, the KCC broadcaster share of audience of an outlet owner is assessed by having the rating divided by the total rating of the broadcasting industry, and it's multiplied by 100. And if an owner has more than two mediums, they got added. And the diagnosis is made when there are more than 30% of these BSA for an outlet owner, and he or she may be regulated. The FCC Diversity Index used the HHI rationale, which is widely used in the economics, and it's actually outlet shares multiplied by media weights and the square of that number. And it makes diagnosis with HHI threshold points. So I would like to raise a question that what is a good threshold for regulation? Because the 30% of current BSA threshold point is rather arbitrary because in July they announced the results for KCC-BSA of 2010, and there were only one owner that had more BSA than 30%, that was KBS affiliates. And because it's publicly owned media, there's no regulation taking place. So we might consider this. So to sum up, I think that because the South Korea KCC was late in devising these measures, they did a pretty good job in understanding audiences and newer media. Working at the FCC, I had a sense that communications policies are designed and implemented by mostly experts from economics, engineering, and predominantly law scholars. But in the KCC's diversity committee, lots of experts from the communications field, business field, law, economics, etc., were recruited. So I think they did a very good job in the audience and covering newer media. Going back to the 4 steps, I think it's important to consider how to incorporate the internet and smartphone in these devices, in these indexes. And also, we might want to think once again about, is it good to include advertising revenue as a criterion for media weights? And what would be a good threshold for regulation? And also, one other sense that I had by working at the FCC was that there are lots of participations in policymaking from citizens. They have this the system of notice of inquiry. So before design and implementing policies, they ask all the players in the society, for example, industry representatives, advocacy groups, and all, to give an idea and feedbacks about the FCC's proposition of policies. So although the KCC went through steps like public hearings and panel discussion with experts, I think there are less participation from citizens, so that would be desirable. But still, since the KCC policies also primarily governs the media ownership, and these policies rest upon the assumption that distinct ownership represent distinct viewpoints, which will be processed by the audiences. And I wanted to make a point that going back to the issue of general service channels, weren't we concerned that the conservative big 3 newspapers come into the TV industry? So the third study, which I presented at our department, focused on the audience, and I created a term, politically diverse viewing, which is essentially audiences' exposure to diverse news contents based on different political advocacies, for example, whether contents are liberal, neutral, or conservative. And I wanted to see their association with democratic citizenship. But for the interest of time, I'll just skip over the third study and wrap up. I'll be happy to talk about this after presentation. So I would like to wrap up what Anne remarked. So far, the discussions around media diversity policies, both in the United States and Korea, I think KCC and FCC can learn from each other. South Korea made interdisciplinary efforts, which led them to have a better understanding of audiences and newer media. But the U.S. tried media diversity index earlier, which is partly why they discarded the index. And also, historically, the U.S. gave more consideration to racial diversity. And also in Korea, rapid influx of foreign immigrants and workers and those foreign people are coming into South Korea. So it might be helpful to consider this. And for future directions, both United States and Korea need work on verify the assumed relations among ownership, content, audiences, exposure, and their processing of these contents to further support their policies focusing on broadcasting ownership. And also, since the KCC is going to announce MII, it would be interesting to continue to pay attention, and it would be great to contribute to the design of MII. And I'd like to end this presentation by once again media diversity. When it is referred as an aim of communication policy, it's the diversity of viewpoints and public opinions. So just primarily focusing on ownership, employment, content, and so on, we are losing our focus on the aim, which is diversity of viewpoints and public opinions. Thank you.